Episode 64, Chapter 60. Chapter 60. Link wasn't sure why he chose to bring Zelda here. Multiple possible reasons occurred to him. It was the first place that he had actually spoken to her after waking, it was where she told him about his mission, it was where he had first seen Ganon, it was the first place he thought of. It could have been any of them. It could have been none of them. Oh, Zelda said, stepping forward to the edge of the Great Plateau Tower, looking out at the expanse of Hyrule with wide eyes. Oh, Link. It might have just been the view. He clipped the Sheikah slate to his belt and stepped up beside her, looking out. Far, far away, he could see the castle. No red haze in sight. And, like tiny insects, he could see the four divine beasts, still resting before Hyrule Castle. I thought that maybe you would like to see the land that you saved, he said. You kept it alive for 100 years. Zelda stared out, eyes wide, tears welling up once more. It's beautiful. A light wind blew past, and she gasped, a shiver running down her body. What is it? Link asked, suddenly concerned. It's the first time I've felt the breeze on my skin in so long. It feels chilly. She looked up at him, her face a mix of emotions. I can feel it. Link stared down at her, taking in her green eyes, her pink cheeks, her full lips, her hair. But he didn't kiss her. Not yet. Though he desperately wanted to. I'm sorry you had to go through what you did, he said, voice soft. It should have never happened like that. I should have protected me. Her lips quirked into a slight smile. You did protect me. You very nearly died protecting me. She paused for a moment. And you remember that, don't you? Yeah. I do. He paused, and then his own smile grew. You were too damn stubborn. Zelda laughed softly. It was like music to his ears. Says the man who fought long past the point that anyone should have had any right to be alive. She hesitantly reached out, touching the front of his tunic, where the blue fabric was charred and frayed after his fight with Ganon. You have so many scars. Better me than you. Perhaps. She continued to touch his tunic. He could feel the light feathery touches through the fabric, and it made his heart race as fast now as it had when facing down Ganon. What else do you remember of that last 2 weeks? He considered for a moment. She had an odd expression on her face. Apprehension, perhaps. Well, I remember that Mount Lanayru is an absolutely awful place to visit in the autumn, no matter when your birthday is. Her cheeks grew considerably pinker at the mention of the mountain. You remember our trip there, then? He reached up and took her hand firmly within his own. She gave a slight start and finally looked back up to meet his eyes. Zelda. I remember everything. 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 She covered her mouth with her free hand, eyes growing round and wide. She squeezed his hand tightly. It took her several seconds to compose herself enough to speak. I feared that I worried that you might never get them back. When did it happen? How? It was on the mountain. Maybe you didn't see, but I made a trip up there after Hateno village. You told me to try to remember the last few weeks before Ganon rose, so I did, and while I was there, the rest of my memories came back. He decided to leave out the part that he suspected the goddess, herself, had been responsible for giving them back to him. He wasn't sure how Zelda would react to hearing about Hylia just yet, and he didn't want to ruin this moment. She stared up at him for a long time. And you remember everything that happened upon the mountain? As if it happened yesterday. She gave a short intake of breath. And do you still feel the same way now? Do you even need to ask? Her blush increased, and she grew flustered. I wouldn't be against hearing it again. He grinned, feeling a rush of warmth at her demeanor and what it implied. I love you. She released a heavy sigh, returning his smile and gripping his hand tightly. I should have told you then. I was wrong. I never should have lied to you. Technically, you never said that you didn't. She grabbed his tunic and pulled him into a kiss. He gladly returned it, releasing her hand and wrapping his arms around her. It was a desperate sort of kiss, full of pent-up emotions, fears, and relief, but then Zelda relaxed in his arms, and soon he felt her smiling against his lips. She began to laugh, shaking. Link pulled away, looking down at her incredulously. What? Zelda shook her head, grinning, and lowered her forehead to his shoulder. I spent the last 100 years dreaming of this day. I can hardly believe that it's really here. He held her tightly against him. This isn't a dream, though. You did it, Zel. She wrapped her own arms around his torso and held tightly to him. We did it. I suppose I can concede that I helped in my own small way. She snorted. So humble. She paused and then looked up at him, eyes shining. I love you. Link grinned, his heart lifting just to hear those words. And then he leaned down and kissed her once again. This time, neither of them pulled away for a very long time. You know, this is the only tower I've ever actually had to climb down, Link said, looking down at the lattice work that led to the tower's bottom. Maybe I should have brought my paraglider. Zelda stepped up beside him, giving him a slight smile, and took his hand. She began to shine with a more subdued golden light than before, and then they both dissolved into golden light that floated gently down to reform on the ground below. Link glanced up around at the tower and then down at her. That's useful. It can be, she said. She turned and inspected the broken dirt and stone around them. These towers were here all along. Right under our noses. I can remember the mound this used to sit under being a popular spot to ride sleds down in the winter. Link remained silent, looking around warily. He could still remember encountering the bokoblins here, just after climbing the tower. It wouldn't do for them to save the land, only to get shot in the back by a cursed bokoblin. I wonder why they ever went underground, Zelda continued, staring up at the tower. Likely it happened around the time of the schism between the royal family and the Sheikah, but why? For that matter, why did they build in that functionality at all? She frowned, looking down. Her fingers twitched, as if she wanted to be writing. They seemed to know so much. Even 10,000 years ago, they were already preparing for Ganon's next arrival. Somehow, they knew what would happen. She glanced up at Link and looked taken aback by his grinning expression. What? Nothing, it's just... Good to hear you theorizing again. I'm not theorizing. I'm observing. Speculation and theorization come later. Right. Of course. I'm pretty sure you've told me that before. Oh, I have. But you've always had a terrible memory. She stepped forward, away from the broken dirt and rock, and Link hurried after again, to keep an eye out for any bokoblins that might still roam this area. You're being too jumpy, she said, bending down and running her fingers through the blades of grass. I was almost shot here. Actually, I was shot here, now that I think about it. He glanced towards the small, grassy hill that the bokoblin archers stood on those months ago. He saw nothing moving and relaxed some. They won't bother us, Zelda said. Why do you say that? Because their master is gone. Trust me on this. She was doing something with her sandals. A moment later, she pulled them completely off and set her bare feet down in the grass. She spun to look at him, smiling broadly. What? I haven't felt grass in 100 years. He forced himself to laugh, though he didn't feel it. He had been asleep for those 100 years. Yes, waking had been confusing, and he had not had his memories, but it never felt to him like a great deal of time had passed. For her, though. Link considered her for a moment and then bent down, undoing his own boots. He pulled them, and his socks, off and stepped up beside her. She smiled and looped her arm in his, looking up and around at the plateau around them. The Temple of Time stood, still as broken and dilapidated as before. He saw a shadow pass over her face. There is so much to rebuild, she said. So much that was lost. There had once been a small town atop the Great Plateau. It had mostly been priests and their families, from what Link could remember. Children had once played on this street. Now only ruins and memories remained. It'll be rebuilt. I think Impa's already started planning for it. She looked ahead quietly for a time. Impa. It will be good to see her, Pura, and Ravi again. I didn't spend a lot of time watching them. Early on, I didn't truly know how to see out of the castle, and I had to devote so much of my energy to quelling Ganon. After a long moment, she smiled. But that is in the past. And now we can start looking to the future. Without Ganon. The future without Ganon. Zelda spoke as if it were a foreign concept to her. How strange to think about. For all my life, my only future was Ganon. Not true. I distinctly remember us talking about how I was going to receive some kind of special title for defeating him. She snorted softly. I don't know if that counts. I was just flirting. I hadn't noticed, he said, somewhat dryly. Knowing you, you probably didn't. You were clueless. I wasn't completely clueless. I knew something. At least, I thought I did. That's probably why I... He trailed off. Perhaps he shouldn't bring that up. That night had been painful for both of them, and it only got worse from there. Zelda clearly knew what he had been about to mention. She looked up at him quietly for a few moments. I wanted to tell you then. Hearing you tell me that you loved me was... She shivered slightly. It was wonderful, but it was also probably the worst possible thing you could have said to me at that moment. Oh. She laughed. That isn't your fault. It was me. I had just... Hylia showed me something when I was praying that day. I didn't understand it, though. Do you? She tapped his forearm with one of her fingers. Do you remember when I told you of my dream of us? On the back of the birds. He nodded, though he was surprised that she still remembered that. 100 years was a long time to remember a dream. He couldn't recall any of his own dreams from that period of time, even with his memories back. I saw it again while praying. And other things. I thought... Well, I thought Hylia was telling me that I had to give up my own feelings for you. I thought she was telling me that our relationship stood in the way of awakening my power. Oh. Link's eyes widened, and suddenly everything made that much more sense. Zelda's refusal, her frustration, her suggestions that he would be happy elsewhere, and even her attempts to push him away. That puts some things into perspective. She nodded slowly. I'm sorry for the pain I know it must have cost you. I wanted so badly to. She stopped, her cheeks growing red. Link's smile grew sly, and he tried to ignore the sudden heat he felt along the back of his neck. You wanted to what? She refused to meet his eyes. Anyway, if you had told me of your feelings even a day before, I would have told you plainly that I returned them. I almost told you myself after we separated from the champions at the foot of the mountain. I was impatient with you for waiting so long. And... I was scared. It would have been a bright spot in a dark time for me. But after your prayer, it was like dangling meat in front of a starving man trapped in a cage. She pressed her lips together. I don't know that I would have called myself starving. I don't know. You kissed me like... He stopped as she playfully elbowed him in the gut. Sorry. I'm probably making too many jokes. She shook her head. No, I'm glad you are. You laugh more now than you used to. I used to laugh with you. She hummed softly in response and looked up towards the Temple of Time. There was silence until, finally, she broke it. I was wrong about what Hylia was trying to show me. In fact, I'm not even sure she was showing me the two of us on the bird. I think she was showing me her previous self. The first Zelda, the goddess reborn. And her very own Link. They were in love. He was named Link. I don't actually know, she said, thoughtfully. That's how I think of him. You and he look very much alike. Either way, Zelda and the hero of that time were in love with each other, and that love is what ultimately helped them through the many trials they faced. That's what Hylia was trying to tell me. That it was alright to love. That it was alright to accept how I was feeling. I spent so much energy denying parts of myself. My scientific nature, my dislike of prayers and silly rituals, my regrets, my resentment. She sighed softly and looked up, meeting his eyes. She was telling me that I was free to love. To feel. Link frowned slightly. And you're saying that would have brought on your powers? If you had told me your feelings. I don't know. Maybe. When my powers awakened, I am certain it was because I acknowledged my love and desire to keep you safe from harm. It is possible that if I hadn't misunderstood, perhaps on that mountain, it wouldn't have changed anything. What? It wouldn't have changed anything, Zelda. Maybe your powers would have awakened, but Ganon still laid its traps well. It still would have attacked while we were away. It still would have killed the champions. The guardians. Maybe we could have beaten it then, but the damage would have been done, either way. And I don't know that we could have beaten it. Not in the state we were in. He could still remember seeing the Master Sword fail. Seeing Castletown destroyed had broken him. He'd all but given up by the end. Would that have changed if Zelda had her power? He doubted it. Yes. Perhaps you are right. There is no way of knowing any longer, though. Either way, I regret my decision that night. The pain I caused you and myself. I'd change it, if I could. Link squeezed her arm tightly, and she leaned into him. Her eyes were drawn away from the Temple of Time and the ruins before it, and they traveled, instead, up the hill to its right. She began to walk, and Link went with her. They climbed the path, remaining in the grass, rather than walking on the cobblestones. As they did, Link found himself remembering his first day after awakening. Seeing bokoblins for the first time and discovering his combat prowess. I was so confused when I woke, he said, speaking softly. I'm sure you were. I can only imagine what possessed you to actually listen to the disembodied woman speaking to you. Well, you sounded pretty, for one. I sounded pretty. I'm fond of your accent. She gave him a flat look. Really? You decided to save the land because of my accent? It certainly didn't hurt. He smiled fondly. I could. Remember, in a way. Even though I didn't know anything, I could feel something. Something in me recognized you. Does that make sense? More than you know. Her expression grew distant and somber. He frowned but didn't push her. She would tell him when she was ready. And, indeed, a minute later, she took a deep breath. There are large periods of time over the last 100 years that I lost myself. She spoke softly, not looking at him. I forgot who I was, where I had been. During those times, all I could remember was that I had to wait. I had to hold on and wait. Someone would come. She cleared her throat, blinking rapidly, and looked up at him. And you did. I wish I had been there sooner. That isn't your fault. You needed to heal. The moment you woke, you started actively working to defeat Ganon. In all my wildest dreams, I never imagined you would be able to do everything so quickly. If it's anyone's fault, it's mine. If I had. Zelda. No, let me finish. If I had stepped out earlier, perhaps you wouldn't have been so injured. I waited until you were nearly dead to finally do something. She looked away from him. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive myself for that. Link stopped walking and pulled her to a stop as well. He reached up and cupped her chin, gently turning her face towards him. You were everything that you were supposed to be. Her cheeks reddened, and he saw tears forming in her eyes. That is not fair. You can't just repeat that and expect it to have the same effect as 100 years ago. He smiled and, deciding that the moment called for it, leaned down to kiss her. She appeared to agree. He dropped his boots and wrapped his arms around her, lifting her off of the ground, their lips never parting. Goddess, it felt good. It was the best feeling that he had ever known, past or present. I wonder what Impa will say, Link wondered when he finally set her back down onto the grass. She scolded me once for speaking of you so familiarly. But, then again. He trailed off. What? Did you know that Pura was placing bets on us? Oh, yes. I did hear about that. She told me. She turned away from him and began to walk again. He quickly picked up his boots again and followed. And you let her? Of course not. I told her to mind her own business. She looked back at him, a mischievous smile on her lips. Which, naturally, only caused her to make even more outrageous claims. Like how you were going to intentionally try to find a way to see me without clothes on. Zelda's smile disappeared, replaced by a look of horror. No. And she claims to have won that bet since you were watching me on my journey. Her cheeks immediately reddened, and she looked away, her expression carefully controlled. Oh, please. At that time, I was the embodiment of Hylia's power. I feel that hardly counts. I'm not so sure, he said, grinning. And neither is she. Well. It's only fair after that time that wasn't on purpose. I'm sure. Link laughed and reached out, taking her hand. She smiled up at him, but then it faded some as she looked past him. A small rock ledge formed an overhang, protecting the ashy remnants of an old campfire still remained underneath it. I condemned my father to a life as lonely as my own, she said. He knew it would be worth it, in the end. He squeezed her hand. And he seemed happy, for what it's worth. Perhaps. They continued up the hill, and finally came to the top, and the cave opening that led into the Shrine of Resurrection. The day's light did not reach far into the cave, and Link could see nothing of the Sheikah doors within. Zelda made no move to enter immediately but simply stared into its depths. Finally, she said, I always feared that, one day, we would have to put this to use. He didn't say anything. He felt odd being back here and looking into the place that he had awoken from. It had been some time since he truly thought of those first few minutes of his new life. The memories weren't bad. Not really. More confusing than anything else, and the fact that he had all of his memories now made them feel almost dreamlike. He could remember not remembering, even though he now remembered everything. It was a strange sensation. Zelda stepped forward, slowly making her way into the cave, and Link walked beside her. They made their way down into the entrance cavern, where the Sheikah door now stood open, and then into the second room, where clothing had been left for Link. And then, finally, into the Chamber of Resurrection, itself. She reached out, placing a finger against the contraption that had saved Link's life. It was empty and dry now, but he could remember the pool of bright blue liquid. He could remember opening his eyes, nearly blinded by the light, though now it seemed dim compared to the sun outside. I wonder. She stepped slowly around the device. I wonder if they knew. I once wondered at the fact that injuries could be so bad as to require this, but this is the only one, as far as I know. She paused and turned, looking at the wall. At the constellation patterns that adorned it. Was this built for you, alone? I don't know. Perhaps it was never meant to be used. She looked back at him, eyebrows raised. What makes you say that? He shrugged. Maybe it was only ever meant as a last resort. I slept in here for 100 years and lost my memory. It worked out for us, in the end, but it seems desperate. She turned, placing a finger on the rim of the pool. She tapped it thoughtfully. Yet it did work out for us. Arguably perfectly so. I had just enough power to hold Ganon for just long enough for you to wake and free the divine beasts. Doesn't that strike you as conspicuous? He hesitated. Put that way, it seemed far too perfect. Almost. Do you think it was planned to happen that way? By who? Hylia. Zelda shook her head. No, not planned. But I think the ancient Sheikah knew. Somehow, they knew that you would fall and be placed in here. They knew that you would eventually reactivate the towers. And they eventually knew that I would visit the shrines. That's probably why there's always an ancient Sheikah waiting for me at the end of them. What? She whirled to look at him. What do you mean? There's... You didn't know. Know what? I was never able to watch you in the shrines. I couldn't see inside of them. I was never able to figure out why. Link's eyes widened. Oh. There are trials within. And each one has a Sheikah at the end, waiting to... Well, congratulate me, I guess.
They're old and fade away right after speaking to me.
Zelda's fingers twitched, and she turned, walking for the exit. Link quickly followed after her.
This could change everything. If there was a way to speak to them, to try to gain some understanding of how they knew all of this. We could start preparing now for the next time Ganon rises, just like they did. The next time. Not during our lifetime, I'm sure. Hopefully not for another 10,000 years. But I'm sure it will eventually return. It is bound.
She glanced back towards him.
As bound as we are.
Link followed her out of the shrine and into the bright sunlight. She already started pacing in the grass outside, a finger tapping her chin. Her forehead had a crease in it that only appeared when she was thinking hard about something. It brought a smile to his face.
Now you are theorizing.
She paused and glanced up at him.
Well, yes. Do you think we could visit a shrine? One that you haven't activated yet. Now.
For a brief moment, it looked as though she was going to say yes, but then she hesitated and shook her head.
No. No, we couldn't do it now.
She turned and began to walk up to the very cliff that Link had approached upon first emerging from the shrine.
There's likely too much to do.
He frowned and walked after her, reaching the top and looking out over the land. Even in the middle of summer, Hyrule still appeared lush and green. Beautiful, with its mountains and valleys, lakes and rivers, fields of grass and thick forests. She sat down in the grass and just looked out at it all. Link sat as well, though his eyes were drawn to her.
Zelda. I genuinely don't know the first thing about running a kingdom, much less rebuilding one.
He was taken aback by the sudden shift in conversation. How had they arrived here so abruptly? Likely something she's been avoiding thinking about. And he had too, if he admitted it to himself.
I'm sure that you have more knowledge than anyone else,
he said, carefully.
Do I?
She looked at him.
My whole life was spent devoted to one thing.
She held up a hand, and it began to glow with soft, golden light.
Understanding how to control this power. And when I wasn't praying or fretting over this, I was studying the ancient Sheikah. I received some lessons, of course, but it was always assumed that either I would succeed and learn after or there would be no kingdom to rule, anyway. No one expected both to end up true. That's not your fault.
She shook her head.
Yes, it is. I could have devoted more of my own studies to governance. I should have. Taxation and ruling bodies and courts and...
She sighed.
I always assumed I would have more time. Or that there would be wise advisors around to help me. Impa's still alive. She used to be an advisor, wasn't she?
Zelda smiled a little sadly.
Yes, but she was the advisor to the king on the Sheikah people, as well as the chief historian. Her areas of expertise were not in ruling a kingdom. That's not to say that she couldn't provide valuable insight, but there is much more to a kingdom than its history. And does there need to be a kingdom?
She hesitated, biting her lip, and then looked away.
I don't know. The Hylians, they need something. They deserve something. A ruler doesn't exist to create laws or maintain order. A ruler is there for a sole purpose to serve his or her people. To protect them. To cultivate them. To help them grow.
She laughed softly.
That was from one of my lessons.
Link felt a twinge of regret at the words. They made it sound as though she, indeed, planned to become queen. And if so? What would he do? Certainly, he would not leave her side. He would marry her, if he could. But was he comfortable with the thought of becoming king?
Either way, the rebuilding of the kingdom is... It's a task that I don't have any idea how to accomplish. It's been 100 years. That is a long time for people to forget that they were once governed by royalty and nobility. I don't know, Zelda. I think the other races are willing to help.
He paused.
Well, I kind of bullied them into it.
She flashed him a slight smile.
But I don't know if any of them would be willing to join with the kingdom again. No, I'm sure they wouldn't. They are used to ruling themselves, and each of them have their own leadership. Really, it's just the Hylians that don't have any sort of central authority. And they are also the weakest and most scattered of them all.
She sighed and leaned into him. Link placed an arm around her shoulder, drawing her close.
Would I be selfish if I admitted that I didn't want to be queen?
She asked, voice growing even softer.
No,
Link said, firmly.
No, you've done all that could ever be expected of you.
Zelda didn't respond to that but simply rested her head on his shoulder. After a few minutes of silence, Link had an idea and reached down to his waist, removing the Sheikah slate. He held it out for her. She turned her head to look at him.
What? It's yours. No. It was never meant to be mine. That was always meant to be used by the hero. And so, it was useful, too. But now, it's yours. Go on.
She hesitated, looking uncertain, and then she looked back down at it. Finally, she took it from him and turned on its screen. She looked quietly at the colorful icons that spread across it.
I wouldn't press the blue one,
Link said, quickly. Zelda shook with soft laughter.
No, I saw what happens if you detonate one of those too close. It makes for an explosive first impression.
She snorted.
That one was a stretch. I just helped defeat an ancient evil. I'm feeling a little stretched thin at the moment. Oh, stop.
He could see her smiling, and it only made him want to continue. He didn't, however, and let her look over the Sheikah slate. She hovered her fingers over the screen's surface. Finally, she pressed the photograph gallery icon. Rows of images appeared. She looked down at them in silence for a long time.
I'm glad to see that these all survived.
She gently brushed her fingers across the screen, occasionally opening one up to the full screen.
You put this through a lot. Well, I've found that ancient Sheikah technology is damned hard to damage.
She snorted, pausing on a photograph of divine beast Vanaboris.
That's for the best. You have a habit of blowing things up. I thought we were done talking about that.
Zelda looked up at him and smiled.
I don't know if we'll ever be done talking about that. Your first interaction with a guardian was to discover how to destroy it, remember? I was saving your life, you know. And I'm not sure you ever thanked me for it.
She shifted enough that she was able to kiss him.
Well, thank you. Though, if you could refrain from blowing up my experiments in the future, I would appreciate it. As long as they don't try to kill us, sure.
She turned her gaze back down to the Sheikah slate and stared at the photograph of Naboris.
I think they've gone now. The champions.
Link nodded slowly.
I think so, too. They said they would, and...
He hesitated, looking inward for a time.
I think Mipha's healing has gone, too. It was tied to her essence, even when she gave it to you. If she has passed on...
Link pulled Zelda closer, resting his cheek on her head.
At least, they're at peace now. Yes.
She flipped through the photographs until she finally landed on the one of all of them. The 6 champions of Hyrule.
But I will miss them. Me too.
He inhaled deeply, finding that her scent hadn't changed, even after so long. Perhaps goddesses didn't need baths.
But I think we'll be all right now. I think everything will be all right.
She sighed softly.
I hope you're right, Link. I could use a little bit of peace, myself.
Link laughed and squeezed her shoulders. They remained on the grassy hill for a long time. Together, at last. End of chapter.